Hello there, everyone. I hope you're doing well. This time, we'll be taking a look at the Second, or otherwise known as the Great Samnite War. This will be the largest and longest of the three wars fought between these two peoples, and during this war, Rome will face one of its most infamous defeats. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here, and let's see how this whole thing began. In the intervening years since the peace treaty amongst the Romans and Samnites was signed, the tensions between the two sides, they never ceased. In fact, the Romans and Samnites, they didn't trust each other at all, and were scared of what the other side still might do. The Romans had continuously been expanding their territory against the neighbors of the Samnites, like the Campanians and the Sidicini. Now, this wasn't a direct attack on them, but the Samnites were definitely always thinking that whatever Rome was doing and whatever land they were taking over could just be the pretext of a Roman invasion into their lands next. So, in the year 328 BC, when the Romans set up a colony on the Samnite side of the Liris River in the former Volscian town of Fregellae, they weren't too pleased with that, and they took that as an act of Roman aggression. The Romans, on their part, they weren't too happy when they found 4,000 Samnite warriors behind the city walls of Neapolis, which is the city of Naples today. The Romans, they had come to the city back in 327 BC because the people of Neapolis, they had been attacking Roman settlers that were living in Campania. And when the Roman Senate sent envoys to Neapolis to ask what was going on and why were you Greeks attacking our settlers, Livy says they gave a defiant reply, basically like, get out of here, you annoying Romans, we can do what we want in our own lands, okay? It's none of your business. Excuse me, but it is our business if you're attacking Roman citizens. It doesn't matter if it's in your territory or not, replied the Romans. How dare you bring violence against a citizen of Rome? We shall bring your response to the people and to the Senate of Rome and see what they say. Well, who do those guys think they are? It's time to go do some warring, is what the Romans said. So, in the year 327 BC, the people of Rome and the Senate declared war on the inhabitants of Neapolis and their allies. One of the two consuls for that year was Quintus Publilius Philo, who was a plebeian politician and had already held the consulship back in the year 339 BC, as well as being appointed dictator, making him only the second plebeian man to ever hold that position. He was also very instrumental in ensuring that one of the two censors would have to be a plebeian, and he also was a censor himself back in 332 BC, where he officially enrolled two newly conquered Latin tribes, the Maesia and Scapetia tribes, in an attempt to really try and bring together and unite these people with the Romans. The other consul for that year was Lucius Cornelius Lentulus, who was the first of the Lentuli branch of the famous Cornelia family, and he will also become a dictator, but that's not until the year 320 BC, so we don't need to worry about that for now. These two men are actually the first two Roman proconsuls in the history of Rome, as well as Quintus being the first plebeian to ever be elected consul back in 339, and before that being the first plebeian to ever be elected praetor. So these are two major figures in early Roman history. At this time, a proconsul was a man that was needed to continue military operations when his term as consul was done. So the Senate, they would extend these men's military commands and allow them to continue to command the army. But all of his other government powers as consul would be gone. So you can continue to run the army you're in command of, but once you return to Rome, you have no powers within like the administration of the government. Now, at this point, war hasn't officially been declared by the Romans or the Samnites against each other. Remember, in Neapolis, it was Greek people who were messing with Roman settlers. So the Romans decided to send some envoys to the Samnites to see if the hostilities between the two sides could be avoided. When the Roman envoys reach the Samnites, they're like, so guys, what's up? Why the heck are there 4,000 Samnite warriors now defending Neapolis? We only have a quarrel with the Greeks from there. Also, why are we hearing rumors that you guys are going around trying to get other people and towns to rebel against us? Like, do you have a problem you'd like to address? The Samnite leadership responded by going off on the envoys, accusing the Romans of wanton aggression, and that it was the Romans who had come into Samnite territory and had built a new colony at Fregellae, a place that the Samnites had taken from the Volsci and then destroyed. Not only have you Romans moved into the same place, but you've also decided to call it the same name as before. So that's like double disrespect to us. And we have nothing to do with those men in Neapolis. They are there on their own accord. Our government did not order them to defend the city, and we couldn't have stopped them from going even if we had tried. And do you think you're so great that only your foes spreading rebellion would cause the people of Pravernum, Fundi, and Formii to want to go against you? No, Roman. It is yourselves who cause words of rebellion to be spoken, not us. And as for Fregellae, we have decided that you must remove the colony you have built there and all the people who live there, and if you choose not to, then we will use everything at our disposal and all of our strength to remove it ourselves. The Roman ambassadors, they offered to take the Samnite grievances back to the Senate and the people of Rome, but in return, the Samnites replied, "Why should we beat around the bush? No diplomacy, no arbitration can adjust our quarrel. Arms and the fortune of war can alone decide the issue. We must meet in Campania." Now, with the war officially underway, Quintus enrolled a new legion at Rome and then headed south along the coast and then made camp near the city of Neapolis. While Lucius, he was able to take command of a legion that had already been raised and garrisoned in Volscian territory. He took command of this force and positioned himself, inland to keep an eye on the Samnites and their movements in the interior. Now, as for the Greeks and the Samnites inside of the city of Neapolis, they had no plans of leaving, because at this time the Romans had only conducted one other siege on this scale, and that was 70 years before this time, when they took the city of Veii. It's really the Greeks and the Carthaginians at this time who were the masters of siege warfare, and the Romans, they also didn't have a fleet, so there was no hope in starving the city's inhabitants out. So Publilius surrounds the city and digs in for a long, hard-fought siege. And for the remainder of the year 327, while Publilius besieged Neapolis, Lentulus, finding no Samnite field army to face him, he took his legion into Samnite territory and raided their lands without finding any resistance, really. And by the time he was done his campaign, the towns of Caliphate, and Rufrium had switched sides and joined the Romans in an alliance. As for the Samnites, during the first year of the war, besides sending that 4,000-man-strong force to help garrison Neapolis, they didn't really do much, or at least what they did wasn't important enough to write down. The Samnites, they weren't really nearly as much of a cohesive people as the Romans were at this time. Really, the Samnite society was mostly just a loosely bound group of mountain tribes that sometimes were allied together and sometimes were fighting amongst each other. I mean, usually this is how it goes for people like this. In the beginning of the year 326, though, news reached Rome that the Samnites had secured an alliance with the Vestini people. They were a Sabine tribe living on the eastern side of the Apennines, and their land was important to Rome because it held one of the few passes that reached into Samnite territory. And the news that the Vestini had allied themselves with the Samnites, well, that worried the Romans that the other Sabine tribes might join with the Samnites as well. Also, at the start of the year, the city of Neapolis would fall to the Romans. Quintus Publilius Philo, again, had continued his siege of the city for the duration of 327, but over the course of the siege, the Romans, they hadn't been able to break the defense. But they had gotten so bad for the civilian population of the city that the part of the Greek population of the city, they began to think about defecting over to the Romans. Two men by the name of Charlaus and Nymphius, apparently two leading men from the city, well, they began to devise a plan that would hopefully allow them to defect over to the Romans and hand over the city to them. in return for some favorable treatment, and in hopes that when the Romans eventually did take the city, that by opening the gates for them, the Romans wouldn't come rampaging through the city and, do all the stuff men do when they sack a city at the end of a siege, if you know what I'm talking about. These two men decided that Charilaus would sneak out of the city and meet with Publilius and offer to open the gates for the Romans. And when Publilius met with Charilaus, he liked the sound of the plan, and he gave him 3,000 men to take control of the portion of the city which was being held by the Samnites. Now, of course, Charilaus, he couldn't just walk up to the gates with 3,000 Roman guys behind him and ask to be let in. So Nymphius' job was to go to the Samnite commander in Neapolis and convince him that it'd be a great time to launch a coastal raid on the Romans, and that he would like to lead a force of men out of the city under the cover of night, down to the beach where the raiding force could be picked up by boats in secrecy, and then launched directly from there as soon as they were ready to go. The Samnite commander, well, he liked the sound of this plan. So he agreed to it, and when the designated night came, he sent most of his troops out of the city and down to the beaches to wait for Nymphius. But Nymphius wasn't there, and neither were the boats he had promised would be. So the Samnite force is kind of just standing around waiting for orders, when all of a sudden they begin to hear shouts of alarm coming from back within the city. Well, turns out that Charilaus had already been let back into the city by his friends through a postern gate, and following behind him were those 3,000 Roman troops, and they had quickly made their way through the city, and had thrown open the main gates of Neapolis, and let the rest of the Roman force in. Now, most of the Greeks that were left in the city, they just sat back quietly and let the Romans take control by destroying the small Samnite garrison that had been left behind by the main force. With the Romans now inside Neapolis, the Samnites down on the beach, they had no choice but to turn and flee, leaving pretty much everything they owned back in the city. Livy says they return home stripped and destitute, an object of derision not only to foreigners but even to their own countrymen. To begin the year of 325 BC, the third year of the war, two new consuls were elected, Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva, who was from the plebeian Junia family, and Lucius Furius Camillus, who had already received a triumph back in 338 BC. The plan for this year was to send Brutus into the lands of the Vestini. Remember from earlier I mentioned how they had allied themselves with the Samnites. Well, now the Romans were ready to make them pay for that. So Brutus enrolled a new legion at Rome and then struck out towards the lands of the Vestini. And when he reached their lands, he began to lay fire and sword wherever he went, until finally he was able to force the Vestini into a pitched battle, which the Romans won, though Livy does say it was a hard-fought and bloody battle. After being defeated in a pitched battle in the field, the Vestini pulled back to their various strongholds and tried to hold out there, but Brutus, he was having none of that. He immediately followed up his victory in the field by taking two Vestinian towns named Cutina and Singilia. Then, when they were done looting, Brutus and his troops, they packed up and they headed back into Roman territory, finishing off a very successful campaign. Now, there is some internal drama we have to talk about. Livy says that the other consul, Lucius Furius Camillus, got sick and had to pass on command to a dictator. The dictator Lucius Papirius Cursor. Another man by the name of Quintus Fabius was named master of horse. Now, while Papirius was back in Rome, getting ready to make his way to the legion he was now in charge of, he gave orders to Quintus, telling him not to move, and not to engage the Samnites in any way. But Quintus had scouts telling him that the Samnites, they were acting like there wasn't even a Roman army in their lands, and that now was a perfect time to launch an attack. So, Quintus, going against the direct orders of the dictator, ordered the troops forward, and after a bloody battle and thousands of Samnite lives lost, the Romans were victorious, and found themselves masters of the field that day. But this is where the drama starts. You see, Quintus didn't really care for the dictator Papirius, and he didn't want him to try and claim his victory for himself. So Quintus gathered up all the weapons and armor and stuff he had just won from the Samnites, and put them all in a big pile, and set it all on fire. He did this so that Papirius wouldn't be able to come and collect it all and use it as a display and a triumph. He also sent messages of his victory back to Rome and to the Senate, but not to Papirius. Of course, Papirius was quite upset when the news reached him what had happened, and right away he left Rome and made his way to the army camp where Quintus was staying. And when he reached the camp, he found that Quintus had a good-sized following of soldiers on his own now. So the dictator called for an assembly of the men. "Answer me this. Did I forbid you to take any action in my absence? Did I forbid you to engage the enemy? In contempt of my orders, whilst the auspices were still indecisive and the sanctions of religion withheld, you dared to give battle? In defiance of all the military custom and discipline of our ancestors, in defiance of the will of the gods? Answer the questions put to you, but beware of uttering a single word about anything else. Lictor, stand by him." Papirius to Quintus. Quintus began by remarking how unjust it was that his accuser was now also his judge, and that it would be easier to deprive him of his life than it would be to deprive him of the glory he had just won. He then went on to exculpate himself, meaning he showed that he was not guilty of any wrongdoing and that it was Papirius who should have charges brought up against him. Now, of course, that accusation was baseless, but it did royally piss off Papirius, who ordered his men to seize and then strip Quintus. But as the lictors were reaching and grabbing at the clothes of Quintus, he called out to his friends among the crowd for help, and Livy says that he fell behind the Triarii, who rose up to protect him. Things were reaching a point of mutiny. I mean, they were getting so bad that even Papirius's own men began to plead with him that he had gone far enough, and he had done enough to punish the youthful spirit of Quintus. But Papirius, he wasn't having it. He ordered his own staff officers to be removed from the assembly, and as they left, they tried to tell him that what he was doing was wrong, and that if a mutiny did occur, nobody would blame Quintus. They would all blame him for causing this strife. Livy says the only reason why the two sides separated was because night fell, and that everyone retired for the night like the two sides had fought a battle. Now, Quintus, he wasn't going to stick around till morning because he knew Papirius wasn't going to change his mind and wanted his head. So during the night, he snuck out of the camp and made his way back to Rome. It was nighttime when Quintus arrived back in Rome, and his first move was to head directly to his father's house, Marcus Fabius Ambustus. The father of Quintus was quite the prominent figure, a consul 3 times and victor over the Herneci, Tibur, and Falisci tribes, which earned him a triumph. And he was also elected dictator once in the year 351 BC, about a couple decades before this time, so he's got quite the distinguished career and carries some weight amongst his fellow senators. And even though it was the middle of the night, Marcus was able to use his authoritas, I guess you could say, or just use his connections and his reputation to get a meeting of the Senate called. But as Quintus is describing his plight, shouts of anger can be heard coming from outside the Senate house. And just moments later, Papirius, led by his lictors pushing their way through the crowd, came storming into the Senate house. Papirius had been made aware of the escape of Quintus and jumped on his horse and began the journey back to Rome as soon as he had heard the news. And now, as soon as he saw Quintus again, he again ordered that the young man be arrested, even though the entirety of the group around him was imploring him to drop the charges against the young man. "Since neither the authority of the Senate nor the years which I, whom you are prepared to bereave of a son, have reached, nor the noble birth and personal merits of the master of the horse, whom you yourself appointed, and entreaties such as have often mitigated the fierceness of human foes and pacified the anger of offended deities. Since none of these move you, I claim the intervention of the tribune of the plebs and appeal to the people. As you are seeking to escape from the judgment which the army has passed upon you, and which the Senate is passing now, I summon you before the one judge who has at all events more power and authority than your dictatorship. I shall see whether you will submit to an appeal to which a Roman king, Tullius Hostilius, submitted. Now, Livy goes on to say that Papirius and Marcus both made speeches from the rostra to the tribunes and to the people, and still the people, the Senate, and the tribunes were on the side of Marcus and Quintus and begged Papirius to reconsider, but he wouldn't budge. That is, until both Marcus and Quintus fell to their knees, pleading and begging for Papirius to drop the charges. And right away, Papirius gave in and said, "Okay, fine. I revoke my charges against you, Quintus, now that you've learned your lesson, and I've embarrassed you enough." Seriously, I'm positive that Papirius, he was never going to kill Quintus. I think he was just really mad that Quintus stole his glory, and he didn't like that everybody saw him as the, super cool hero general guy. So he set out to change everybody's image of Quintus. And by bringing him in front of everyone back in Rome and having not only Quintus groveling on the ground for his life, but his father Marcus as well, well, it did just that. It did just the trick. Instead of coming home a war hero, Quintus came running home to his father and then it ended up crying on the ground. So definitely not as good of a look as he would have had if Papirius had just let him be. Alright, so now that the Romans have sorted that out, let's get back to fighting some Samnites. Papirius, after the ordeal with Quintus, left Rome again and made his way back to the military camp, where this whole ordeal had started. But now, the morale amongst his troops was quite low. Livy actually writes that if the soldiers had fought half as hard as they could have in the upcoming battle, that the Samnite War could have and probably should have been ended that day. But the guys didn't really feel like going all out and risking their lives for Papirius at the moment, and really they wanted his reputation to take a little bit of a hit. So Livy says the soldiers purposefully threw the fight so that the loss would look bad on Papirius. Now, to Papirius's credit, he was able to see what the issue was and realized that his men weren't too happy with him and how he had treated Quintus. So Papirius went around the camp and checked on the wounded men and asked them how they were doing and just acted like he cared about his guys, basically. And over the course of a few days, the men's feelings toward Papirius softened, and they returned to obeying their general. It also probably really helped when Papirius told the men that all the spoils of the upcoming campaign would be going to them. Livy goes on to write that with the order restored amongst his troops and confidence renewed in himself and the men, Papirius went on to rout the Samnites in a battle, and then his army advanced through Samnite lands, plundering at will until the Samnites made overtures of peace and offered to pay his men a full year's salary and give them all a set of garments if they were to withdraw. And with the Senate's permission, Papirius accepted and took his army home, where he received a triumph. The following year of 323 BC wasn't very eventful. Livy writes that the two consuls for the year were Gaius Sulpicius Longus, whose grandfather was a consular tribune, back in 390 BC, when the Gauls sacked Rome, and Quintus Aulus Serenatus. Sulpicius is said to have gone into Samnite territory and ravaged it, while Serenatus went into Apulian territory and did the same thing there, but neither man was met by an enemy in the field. Also, this doesn't have anything to do with the war, but I just felt like telling you. Apparently, one night in Rome, the alarm was raised all around the city, and it was so serious that the troops began to man the walls, and even the citizens began to arm themselves. And for the entire night, the Romans were just sitting there on edge, just waiting for an attack. or for something to happen. But when morning came and the light calmed, everyone's nerves, nobody could actually figure out a reason as to why the alarms had even gone off in the first place. Getting back on track here, the war continued into the year 322, and Livy writes that the two consuls for that year were Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus. Yes, that is actually the same Quintus, the same man that we were just talking about from before, who got into it with Papirius. It's been a few years now, and his fame has only grown. And the other consul was Lucius Fulvius Curvus. Now, it's here where sources vary. Some historians say that it's these two men that led the armies in 322, but Livy writes that a dictator, Aulus Cassius Arvina, was elected, and that it's he that was leading the army and was the one in charge during this next large battle with the Samnites. I'm just going to keep it simple and go with Livy's interpretation, since I've been using him for the majority of my research, but if you go looking this up, you just know you might run into some confusion about who was commanding the Roman forces against the Samnites in the year 322. So, after the dictator Cassius gathered together an apparently exceptionally fine army, he marched it into Samnite territory, where he was promptly caught off guard by a large Samnite force who had somehow not been seen by the Roman scouts and had shown up outside all around the Roman camp. With nightfall approaching, the Samnites, they didn't launch an attack straight away, but Aulus knew that he and his men were in trouble. So during the night, he tried to sneak his men out of the camp, but Samnite scouts saw them and alerted the rest of the Samnites that the Romans were apparently running in fear. But since it was dark, the Samnite infantry, they stayed inside their camp, while the cavalry followed the Romans at a distance until the sun began to rise and light up the world. That's when the Samnite cavalry, they began to harass the rear of the Roman column, which in turn slowed down the entire Roman force, so much so that the Samnite infantry was able to catch up to where everybody was, and now full-on battle was going to have to be fought. Aulus ordered that the baggage was to be removed to the rear and that a battle line be formed. The Samnites, seeing the Romans preparing for battle, also formed up, and then, after the two sides of men roared their battle shouts at each other, they charged. From 9 o'clock till 2 in the afternoon, the contest was maintained so equally on both sides that the shout which was raised at the first onset was never repeated. The standards neither advanced nor retreated. In no direction was there any giving way. They fought, each man keeping his ground, pressing forward with their shields, neither looking back nor pausing for breath. Their noise and tumult never grew weaker. The fighting went on perfectly steadily, and it looked as if it would only be terminated by the complete exhaustion of the combatants or the approach of night. A passage from Livy. But now, after about 5 hours of vicious back-and-forth fighting between the two sides, a troop of Samnite cavalry had managed to find their way a good distance behind the Roman rear, but instead of looking to secure the victory and charge the Romans from the behind, they decided it'd be a much better idea to go and start looting the Roman baggage that Aulus had ordered to be removed to the back before the battle started. A young Roman messenger ran up to the dictator and told him about the baggage being looted, and he was like, fine, who cares, we have a battle to fight here. But then the soldiers were like, wait a second, that's all our stuff, you better do something about that. So Aulus sent for the master of horse, none other than Marcus Fabius Ambustus, Quintus's dad from before, and told him, hey man, now's your time to shine. You take the cavalry and go deal with those guys looting our stuff, and I'll stay here and deal with the infantry battle. Leading the cavalry, Marcus formed his men up in order and then charged the Samnites, who were busy looting and had become scattered and unorganized. Many of them now actually were on foot and were encumbered with spoils. Livy writes that the Samnites had no chance and most of them were cut down, while a few were able to flee the battlefield. Then, instead of making the mistake of chasing the fleeing men, Marcus reorganized as much of his cavalry force as he could, and then circled around back of the battlefield and charged his cavalry into the rear of the Samnite lines. The Samnites, now surrounded, stood no chance, and thousands of them were killed, including their commander. With this devastating loss, the Samnites then began to advocate for peace, even going so far as to blame a specific person, one Brutalis, Papias, for breaking the truce and causing the war. Brutalis, though, decided he wasn't going to be delivered over to the Romans, so he offed himself. But even so, his body was brought to the Romans and all his property and land forfeited to them. The Romans, though, they didn't accept any of it and only took back Roman prisoners who had been held by Brutalis, and as far as they were concerned, the surrender meant nothing. After a triumph was given to Aulus and his dictatorship ended in 321 BC, two new consuls were elected for that year, the plebeian Titus Veturius Calvinus and the patrician Spurius Postumius Albinus Caudinus. And we are about to see why he has that last name. The Romans, though they have been winning the majority of the battles so far during the war, they hadn't really made much headway into the actual Samnite homelands. That's what Aulus was trying to do when he almost got defeated in the previous battle. So this year, the two consuls, they wanted to combine their forces and march them into the central Samnium plateau and ravage the homelands of the Samnites. So they gathered up their legions and headed towards the allied town of Calatia. Soon after reaching the town and setting up camp, a group of shepherds came into the Roman camp, declaring that the Samnites were in the process of taking the allied town of Lucaria. Now, these shepherds, they were actually just Samnite soldiers in disguise. The Samnite leader, Gaius Pontius, had ordered them to go to the Romans and tell them this because he lived not too far from the Caudine Forks, and he knew that if the Romans were going to go and help their allies, they would have to take one of two paths to get there, and he was betting that they'd take the shorter route. To the Romans, it wasn't a question of whether they were going to go and help their allies or not. It was just a decision of which route to take. There was one that was much safer and through a nice open country, but they'd have to go all the way back and around the whole mountain range. The second path was much, much shorter, and it led through Caudine Forks. The two consuls chose option number 2. Gaius Pontius, the Samnite commander, watched from the heights above the valley as the entire Roman force began to make its way towards what they thought was the only other route out of the grassy plain they were on. And as the last of the Romans filed in through the first opening, he ordered his men to quickly descend to the pass's opening and to build fortifications blocking the way out. Earlier that day, he had done the same thing to the other side's opening, and unbeknownst for now, the Romans had just walked into a perfectly placed trap. After reaching the far side of the pass and finding it blockaded with felled trees and large boulders, the Romans turned around, but quickly found out that the other way that they had just come was also now blocked in the same fashion, and the realization settled in that they were trapped. Shocked into a daze, the Romans began to go through the motions of building a camp, but nobody was thinking that some hastily built walls was going to save them. They all knew they were in a very, very bad spot. The two consuls, Titus and Spurius, they just hid away in their tents, unsure of what to do as the men silently went about building the camp. All the while, the Samnites jeered at them from the heights above. Night fell over the valley, but the Romans, they got no sleep. They spent the entire night arguing about how they were going to get out of this situation. And as for the Samnites, they were a little stuck on what to do with all these Roman men they had just captured. So Gaius Pontius sent a letter to his father asking him what to do. And the story goes that at first he said you should spare them all, but then he said no, you should kill them all. Well, let me explain, son. If you choose option 1, we could be establishing a peace with the most powerful people in Italy. If you choose option 2, it will win us the war, but the Romans will never forget what we did to them, and generations from now, they will come for revenge, and they won't stop until they get it. Gaius was like, "Okay, Dad, shut up and get out of here, please. That didn't help us at all." Luckily for him, though, after the Romans had tried to break out a couple times through the blockades and suffered heavy losses, and with their food running low, it had been a few days since any of the men had had a good meal, and they were beginning to get hungry, the Romans were beaten. The 2 consuls sent messengers to Pontius to ask for terms. Gaius received these messengers and demanded that all the war was to immediately end, and that each Roman soldier must give up their arms and armor, being left with only a tunic, and they must pass under the yoke. He also wanted 600 equites as hostages, and that these men would be held in Samnium so that the Romans wouldn't break the other terms of the treaty, which were: the colonies of Fragile and Cales must be evacuated of Romans, and that all other Roman armies must leave any Samnite territory, and lastly, that a foedus aquum must be signed, which was a treaty of equals, and that the Romans and Samnites would henceforth live in peace under their own laws. Now, of course, none of the Romans took these terms well, but they didn't really have a choice. All they could do was grumble and protest in vain, but nothing could stop the dreaded hour of their punishment from coming. Firstly, the 600 prisoners, they were taken away, and then each man took off his armor and dropped his weapons, leaving the camp with only a tunic. They were all herded together, and the first made to pass under the yoke were the consuls themselves, stripped of their paludumenta, and looking as ragged as a couple of common beggars. The soldiers turned their eyes away from this outrage. After the consuls were done, it was the legionnaires' turn, and one by one the men filed through the yoke, all while being insulted and poked and prodded by the Samnites with their swords and spears. Some of the men were even killed for reacting too much when they were stabbed. For hours, the Romans slowly made their way through the yoke and out of the Caudine Forks pass. Livy writes that the column of men could have reached Capua, an allied city, by nightfall, but the men, they were much too ashamed of what had just happened to them. They all decided to sleep on the side of the road that night. The next day, though, some citizens from Capua, they came out to greet them, the men, and bring them food and provisions, as well as to help guide them back to Roman territory. By now, the city of Rome, they had been made aware of the disaster at the Caudine Forks, and immediately the city went into mourning. When the men returned to the city, Livy writes that they waited until darkness fell, so that they could sneak back into their homes, and that for days afterwards, not one of them, not even the consuls, showed their face in public due to shame. Now, Livy goes on to write how in the next Senate meeting, Postumius, he's called upon to explain the disaster at Caudium, but instead he was just like, yeah, I screwed up, and you guys should sacrifice me and all of us who surrendered to the Samnites, and by doing that, it will relieve the people of Rome and the Senate of this stupid peace treaty we had to sign, and then you guys can get all back to waging war. But when he and a bunch of guys showed up outside the walls of Caudium a few days later, Pontius, the Samnite leader, was like, yeah, no, nice try there, buddy. We do not accept this surrender, and we don't want these losers, so take them back to Rome, and the treaty is still on, and if you attack us in any way, well, then you can deal with the wrath of the gods. There's even a part where Postumius, he knees one of the Roman fedials that was with them in the stomach, and then yells out that he's a Samnite, because he thought that by doing that, the gods would think that a Samnite citizen had attacked a Roman envoy, and then they'd be mad at the Samnites instead of the Romans for breaking the truce. But, even Pontius was like, bro, really? Really? If you really think that's gonna work, do you even actually believe in the gods? Come on, bro. And with that, the war continues into the year 320, where 2 new consuls are elected. Firstly, our old pal Lucius Papirius Cursor, the dictator from 325 BC, who had that whole ordeal with Quintus Fabius. And also Quintus Publilius Philo, who was elected for the third time as consul. Publilius, he recruited his army and marched into Samnite territory, staying near Caudium, while Papirius gathered his army and went to besiege the town of Lucaria in Apulia, because he had heard this is where those 600 Roman equites were being held prisoner. Now, it's very brief, but Livy writes that the Samnites did try to fight Publilius, but due to the fact that his men were so hyped up and ready to get revenge after the Caudine Forks that he didn't even get to give them orders. The Roman infantry, they just saw red and charged the Samnites, who easily broke and fled, most of them running all the way to Lucaria and regrouping there. Papirius then marched through Apulia a little bit, gathering allies and taking pledges of loyalty to Rome. The people here had had enough of the Samnites and were ready to join the Roman side. Livy writes that the Samnites, who were mountain folk, came down and raided the Apulians, who were coastal farmers, quite frequently, and over time this had caused the Apulians to despise them. Papirius eventually reached Lucaria and found his consular colleague besieging the town, but Publilius and his men, they were struggling just as much as the people trapped inside the city due to a lack of provisions. Now that all changed when Papirius showed up with grain from the Apulians. Seeing this, the Samnites knew there was no hope of holding out against the Romans, and they knew their only hope was to offer battle and win it. But before the battle started, some Tarentine guys showed up and they were like, "Hey, you better not fight, or else if you do, we're going to join the Samnites over there because you guys are being bullies." Papirius looked at them, and these are Livy's words. "You see, we're going into action with the sanction of the gods." That's all he said to them. Basically, okay, cool, don't care, we're doing whatever we want, go ahead and join them if you want to. The Romans then formed up into two divisions and made their way up to the trenches and walls of the town and began to tear down the defenses, all the while screaming out how there weren't any Caudine Forks here, no trickery this time, just Roman valor, which couldn't be stopped by any man or defenses that they erected. They slew alike those who fought and those who fled, armed and unarmed, slaves and free men, young and old, men and beasts. Not a single living thing would have survived had not the consuls given the signal to retire. And by stern commands and threats driven, soldiers who were thirsting for blood out of the enemy's camp. Passage from Livy. After getting the men to fall back from the town in fear that if he let them continue their slaughter, the Samnites would execute the hostages that were still being held somewhere inside the town, it didn't take long for the surviving Samnites to send an envoy to Papirius, offering him just what he wanted. All 600 of the prisoners, who all belonged to the most wealthy families of Rome, were to be returned if he would just lift the siege. Papirius was like, "Well, did you ask Pontius? You know, since last time you all thought it was a good idea when he told you to send our boys under the yoke? You can go back to your people and tell them to leave all the goods and all the beasts of burden, and that all of the non-combatant population must leave the city with only one garment of clothing. They then will pass under the yoke, and we will do the same to you as you did to us." Livy writes that an enormous amount of booty was found.
That's what she said.
And that all of the 600 prisoners were rescued as well. In total, about 7,000 people were walked under the yoke, including Pontius, the Samnite commander who was in charge of the Caudine Forks. And he states that never had any Roman victory changed the circumstances of the state in such a way. From what seemed like a certain defeat to a decisive victory, the Romans had fully bounced back from the embarrassing loss they had suffered earlier. Papirius wasn't done, though. The very next year, 319 BC, he was elected consul again alongside Quintus Aulus Serenatus, who I mentioned briefly earlier when he was elected consul in 323 BC. Serenatus is said to have taken on the Frentanians, who were not a part of the Samnites, but they had broken their treaties with Rome after the Caudine Forks. Livy writes that Serenatus faced these people in one battle, and then followed the fleeing Fratanians, that was hard, to a town where they eventually surrendered and capitulated to Rome. Now, some modern historians, they assume or presume that this could have been the first time that these peoples had fought the Romans in battle. So kind of sucks for these guys to have to face off against Roman legions when like all you've got is like the local men and boys from the surrounding area. Papirius is said to have gone on a quick campaign against the Satricans, who were a Volscian peoples. They too had revolted when the news of the Caudine disaster had reached them, but now that Papirius and his army was rampaging through their lands and getting close to the town, they sent requests for peace. Papirius told the envoys that if you hand over the Samnites that are within the city, or put them to death yourselves, then we're all good. But if you don't, then I'm coming in, and all of you guys are on the hook. So the envoys, they went back to the city, and they spoke to their senate, and while that was happening, the Samnite garrison that was within the city, they made it very clear that, you know what, we're just going to leave during the night. Well, some of the Satricans, they thought it would be a good idea to let Papirius know exactly when and through what gate the Samnites were going to leave. And during the night, while the Samnites marched down a forest path, the Romans launched an ambush which killed many of the Samnite warriors and sent the rest fleeing into the woods. Papirius, after then taking control of the city, launched an investigation to find the people responsible for rebelling and had them scourged and beheaded in the town square. After this, he returned home to Rome and received another triumph. Now, with the so-called Caudine peace still in effect, the years of 318 and 317, they're actually pretty quiet between the Romans and the Samnites, besides some envoys in 317 from various Samnite communities individually coming to Rome and securing 2-year truces for themselves. Rome, though, they weren't sitting back and doing nothing. The cities of Teanum and Canusium surrendered to Rome during these years, and in Capua, Roman prefects were appointed. Also, a written law was given to the city. 2 other towns, Ferentum and Nerulum, they were captured by the Romans, and with this new territory and more Romans being settled there, 2 new tribes were created, the Ufentine and the Falernian. Livy writes that not only were the arms of Rome spreading, but her laws too, surrounding the Samnites on all sides with peoples allied to Rome. And with that, I think that is where I shall leave part 1 of the Second Samnite War. It is far from over, and there is still many years of fighting between the Samnites and the Romans left. But hopefully you enjoyed the stories from the first part of this war, and I hope to see you again when I return to the times of the Roman Republic and one of its greatest foes, the Samnites. Thanks for listening, and have a good one.
What a dreadful noise plebs make when they're happy.